Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining FSMA Friday here. We're January, we're in 2022 already, and we're excited to get things going this year. My name is Aaron Bolshaw. I'm the moderator for FSMA Fridays, which for anyone who's joining us for the first time, it's an ongoing monthly industry update for food and beverage facility operators, QA, safety and compliance professionals, and the like. Safety Chain teams up with the Atchison Group, a fine company, and we bring you guidance, thought leadership, best practices on a host of topics revolving around the Food Safety Modernization Act. So we keep you up to speed on anything changing. And today we're reviewing a topic that's actually, I really like this. So there's some edginess to this and I like it. We're going to be talking about chemophobia, some misconceptions, risks, some hazards, right? And with us today is Brent Koblish from he's the director of food safety at the Atchison Group. Welcome, Brent.
Thanks, Aaron. It's fantastic to be with you.
Yes, yes. And we've got an interesting topic today. And before we get into that, Brent, I just wanted to make sure everyone understands we can't hear them, right? But we do want to hear from them. And the way to do that, everyone, if you look to the right, it should be on the right side of your screen at home there or at the office. When you have a question, just dial it in there, type it in. We'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation when we get to wrapping everything up, okay? So a couple of things about Brent to just introduce you. So you were once the toxicology manager for General Mills, had a lot of regulatory affairs experience at Cargill, and you actually rolled out FSMA at Cargill, was that right?
Well, yeah, I oversaw the rollout of FSMA across US FDA registered facilities for Cargill, but had a fantastic group of individuals who helped as well.
Yeah, of course. So that's a big organization to do FSMA for. But I really like, Brent, your background in toxicology through your career and indeed in your academic life. You do have that PhD from Rochester School of Medicine. And this is a perfect, like the topic you're speaking about today in this fear of chemicals, right, which is chemophobia. This is great. So I appreciate you joining us. Why don't you start out, if you will, just giving us the high-level updates of FSMA, what we've seen, some updates.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Aaron. Well, thank you so much to Safety Chain, Aaron and Kirsten for inviting me on here. Thank you all, 81 of you so far who've attended and chose to attend this. So appreciate you tuning in. But some FSMA updates that I think are front and center. Some of these may be similar to last month's with a few additions. So public meetings on the proposed changes to agricultural water requirements in the produce safety rule will occur February 14th and 25. So you want to look those up on the FDA's website to learn how you may be able to tune into that. That will be beneficial to you all. Through January 19th, I know we're past that. The FDA is limiting its inspections to mission critical due to obviously the ongoing pandemic. Could this extend into February? Possibly. So I think, you know, if you're tuned into FDA alerts, regularly checking the FDA website, that's something that would be beneficial to you and your organization. They have announced that they're postponing scheduled international inspections planned to start in February, still utilizing remote authority for foreign supplier verification program inspections as well. So again, you know, it's a very dynamic process in which ORA, or the Office of Regulatory Affairs, is gearing up to continue inspections or postponing those internationally, especially as different countries have different requirements, et cetera, or may not allow any individuals into the country for inspection purposes. So keep that in mind. Definitely a dynamic time to live. I want to draw your attention to, in April, the FDA's may be proposing action levels for lead in baby food. While not directly specific to FSMA rules, could this impact hazard analyses and risk-based preventive controls possibly. While we see this heavy metal activity in baby foods in the setting for action levels, could we see this impact conventional foods later on? I would say yes. So it's something to keep in mind, something that the agency is concerned about, and something that they're going through in terms of making sure the food supply continues to be safe and compliant with regulatory actions. So
yeah, that's a good point. That could open up some new thoughts and around lead. So good to keep an eye.
Absolutely. All right, so moving right along here, let's get into the topic of the day, chemophobia. What does the word chemical feel like to you? Well, in today's society, I would say that it's mostly associated with a number of negative feelings. According to the Center for Research on Ingredient Safety at Michigan State University, really some of the main feelings that consumers feel around just the word chemical is disgust, fear, negativity. But what is driving this negativity? If we look at some of the data out of Europe from this particular article, you'll see that there are a lot of misconceptions about chemicals out there that drive this fear. Now, this isn't just a European-centric view. I would surmise that you would find similar sentiment if you polled the US population and other populations throughout the world as it relates to the word chemicals and chemophobia. So if we take a look at some of these questions or statements, I do everything I can to avoid contact with chemical substances in my daily life. 40% of individuals responding agree. And if you look at the N number here, I know we have a lot of scientists on the phone. That's not a trivial amount of people that have been polled. So that 40% is a significant number. I would like to live in a world where chemical substances don't exist. Again, close to 40% agree with that sentiment. And my question is, well, do you drink water? That's a chemical. We can call it dihydrogen monoxide. Obviously, we don't. I think that would drive chemophobia into overdrive if we start calling water dihydrogen monoxide. But that's one of the issues of chemicals, is this lack of education, I think, around chemicals. But the other issue too, I believe, is how we characterize it in the food industry. We don't call a banana, for instance, by these ingredients. We just call it a banana. But if we were able to, or if we had to label an all natural banana or all natural blueberries, what do you think consumers would think about this ingredient deck? In this age of simplifying ingredients or clean labels, etc., I wouldn't think that this would be considered a clean label. If we had more time, I would go into a very clean label in terms of the reduction of ingredients, and it's only about 5 or 6 ingredients long. But 5 or 6 ingredients is what makes up decon. So it's not really necessarily, can we judge a book by its cover, by just the ingredient deck? No. Right. But I think that it's this lack of education. It's also the fear mongering that can occur around chemicals themselves in our daily news. Let's face it, in today's world, fear drives headlines. It also drives chemophobia. I mean, if I was a consumer, well, I am a consumer, but many consumers see these headlines and they don't know how to interpret it, how to interpret the risk. They just see hazard. And we'll get into that a little bit as a way to help alleviate some of these symptoms of chemophobia in our supply chain and in food in general. So this chemical is found every day in everyday food, linked to cancer, you need to be aware of. I'm drinking coffee right now. There's 300 carcinogens in this coffee. I would bet if we went out and tried to ban coffee, we would instigate World War III. Not really, but what I'm saying is that, what we don't know can sometimes impact our decisions. But what we do know can also impact those decisions. And sometimes if we do know some things and we're afraid of that thing, it can drive our decisions to avoid some of these common ingredients that are found in foods. If we continue along the same messaging here, MSG, sodium glutamate is found in ripe tomatoes. So is MSG really something we should be worried about? The headlines say that it is. Heavy metals, chemicals found in many spices, Consumer Report study finds. But what is the real risk? And I think sometimes the worst purveyors of some of this information are us as scientists as well. We need to do a better job of getting back to the basics. In my mind, I think that we can distill it down to this really linear approach to science. I believe mathematics explains physics, physics explains chemistry, chemistry explains biology, and biology explains physiology. Without chemistry, without chemicals, biology doesn't exist. And so on and so forth. And so, is this something we need to fear? No, I don't think we need to fear a lot of these things. And I think sometimes when there are chemicals that we really need to control, especially in the food supply, these messages are diluted by the rampant chemophobia that's out there. So what's one of the avenues we can take is to articulate risk well. And I will say some of the worst purveyors of hazard assessment or risk assessment are scientists themselves. We may not all agree on this approach, and I don't think this is how we solve this problem of chemophobia, but it's a tactic in a way to help get our arms wrapped around this pandemic of chemophobia, not only in food, but any consumer products. So I'd say the world is full of hazard assessors who seem to know very little about risk, how to assess risk, how to manage risk, and how to communicate risk. But risk takes a tripartite approach, and all of these are very important. And in this order, first we have risk assessment, then we get into how do we manage that risk, and then third, how do we communicate that risk? All are incredibly important in the risk paradigm, and it involves more than just scientists. Science might start the conversation, but it may not be the sole purpose of how we manage and how we communicate the risk. Sometimes the management has to do with regulatory non-compliance. Sometimes it has to do with perceptual risk, and so on and so forth as we get into communication. And so science, though, should start. It should be the bedrock, in my belief, in an appropriate risk paradigm. But according to the world, risk equals hazard, or perception in this case. But that's not what risk is. Risk really is a function of hazard times exposure. If we go to your FSPCA or FSMA training, sometimes risk is categorized by the occurrence or likelihood of occurrence times the severity of that hazard. Just basic mathematics will tell you if you multiply a number by a very low number, the answer is a low number. So if the exposure is low, but the hazard is high, or the exposure is non-existent, the risk is going to be low. One important point here that I think is lost on many individuals is that there's no such thing as zero risk. It doesn't exist. There is always risk with something. But just because there is a small or negligible risk doesn't mean it needs to be something we need to be fearful of. And I think we need to do a better job as risk assessors, managers, and communicators to help alleviate some of this. And so that's the common theme here. Risk management includes more than just safety, right? We start with safety. Safety is number one. If it's not a safe product, we need to do something about that. If we go into manufacturing a product that may or may not be unsafe, we need to assess that risk according to safety. Then we move into the regulatory compliance piece. Do we destroy the product? Do we withdraw product? In the US, do we recall the product? according to a class 1, 2, or 3 recall? How do we manage? It may not be a safety issue. As if you refer to the classifications of recalls under the US paradigm, a recall under a class 3 recall is generally not going to be a safety issue for the consumer. But it is a recall nonetheless. And then there's also not meeting customer specs, not meeting our quality standards, and then also perceptions. Many of you, if not all of you, have been in conversations with senior level executives that you may want to get out of a certain ingredient or a certain supply chain because of the perceptual risk. My question though is, are we doing more damage by getting out of a certain ingredient or a certain practice, and we're doing more damage by perpetuating a chemophobia, if you will, in that particular consumer group? I understand completely the need to address consumer concerns and provide more options within the marketplace. I totally understand that, and I think as a food industry, we need to tackle those things. But we need to do so in a responsible manner to not perpetuate a myth that this product is safer than that product and vice versa. Because what we're doing is continuing down this path of perceptual issues when what we should be doing is correcting some of these perceptions going forward. And so doing it in a responsible manner of marketing and risk communication, which we're going to get into secondarily here, is appropriate when looking holistically at some of these marketing claims or changing our supply chain or the products we produce. So when we look at risk communication, it's often more difficult than the assessment management. What do we communicate? What are we going to say? How do we do it? Do we do it in social media? Do we do it over the phone? Do we do it in emails? How do we do it? Who's the audience? Who does this impact, and what's the perception? What are we trying to course correct or maybe not course correct? Have you ever thought of, do we even need to communicate anything? Some of the strongest form of communication is saying nothing. And that might be appropriate in certain circumstances. One of the things I found in my career is that how do we expect as an industry, as a food industry, as a consumer packaged good industry, to win over the vast majority of consumers when some of our staunchest critics are those within the four walls of our organization? Have we done enough to educate those individuals who may have questions themselves? And let's face it, while most of us, if not all of us, work in the food industry, we're consumers just like anybody else. We just happen to work in the food industry. So let's not be so quick to go out externally and communicate things when sometimes our biggest advocates or sometimes our biggest critics may be those individuals that we work side by side who may need to be educated or may need to have a conversation around a given product, a given ingredient, or something that they heard on the news the night before. So I think that's a very important component. I know many of you may work in plant settings, in the manufacturing setting. I think if there is these risk assessment opportunities as they come up, whether to release product, whether to destroy product, et cetera, I think it needs to be a very robust conversation, no matter what the decision may be. Because there may be individuals who may not agree with the decision, they may agree with the decision. And I'm not saying that these individuals necessarily are going to be at the quote unquote table being the decision makers, but I think this goes really deep into the idea of food safety culture and making sure that it's a robust conversation around risk or lack thereof, and then communicating that internally so that the food safety culture can flourish and make sure that the right decisions are being made. It really boils down to integrity and character, and making sure that you're doing the right thing when no one's watching. Or when someone is watching, you're also doing the right thing, but also communicating why you took an appropriate action or not. You release product that you deem to be safe and within regulatory compliance. One of the things I want to highlight here before we end our day and move into the Q&A portion, the Center for Food Integrity has really done an exceptional job of looking at what drives consumer trust, especially in the food industry. Now, I could tell you all day long, I'm Brent Koblish, here's my resume, I've got 1,000 letters after my name, and so you should trust what I say. But literature shows that skills are just a small subset of what really drives consumer trust. And time again, shared values are 3 to 5 times more important in building trust than demonstrating competence. So I can tell you, I've been around the block 35 years. I know what I'm doing. But if someone listening to me doesn't have a shared set of values that I'm coming from, they may or may not agree with my approach based on that alone. And so I think that's very important when you go back to your organizations, when you go back to your teams, that what's driving trust in their minds is a set of shared values that you may share with that individual or that team of individuals. So I think that's very important to consider as it relates to the risk communication piece. And I hope that as we go down this path, we could talk about this for a whole semester. But I've just given you a little snippet of what I think in terms of getting our arms wrapped around this fear of chemophobia that's really driving a lot of people's decisions, how we can somewhat remedy that fear by making sure that we put the appropriate risk in perspective. We're able to assess it, manage it, and communicate it effectively with our constituents. So I really appreciate the time, and I'd be happy to take any questions. So Aaron, back over to you.
Yeah, so I had one thing I wanted to add, and then we're going to have, excuse me, Kristen Meyerhofer, ask some of these questions. You put something here, and I want to make sure from the marketing standpoint, I want everyone to look at who wrote this. To your point just now, Brent,
yes,
it doesn't matter the expertise, it's the shared value, and this proves it. This is an SEO writer. SEO stands for search engine optimization. The entire reason that was written was for a headline to help this, whatever this was, sell ads. That's it. So that point that you made about, it's more about shared values, I really appreciate that viewpoint, Brent. I think it struck me when I looked at this, I was like, oh yeah, this guy that wrote this is not an expert in chemicals, in science, or food safety. I guarantee it. What he was given was a list of words that he should write about, and that's how it was built. And those words are more attractive to that shared values on the left side. I think that was fantastic. So, all right, well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten, if you would, if there's some questions out in the world.
Yeah, so hello everyone. This is a really informative presentation. So thank you, Brent. Really, I agree. You could spend an entire semester talking about this. We just had a question come in from Lydia. Do you have any recommendations for how to address just the very publicized produce dirty dozen, where the presence of pesticide residues, which are below EPA limits, but is perceived by the public is that the presence of any residue makes the fruit or vegetable unsafe. So recommendations for how to address that, the dirty dozen and the presence of pesticide residues.
When I communicate risk to those individuals that may not have a science background, which I think that there's a lot of individuals, and even with a science background, require some re-education, is to really look at the units. We're talking about parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. So you could first start out that EPA sets these limits for pesticide residues and get into the regulatory compliance. But then you might have individuals, yeah, well, I don't trust the EPA. That's fine. You get into the units. A part per trillion is 1 second in 32,000 years. That may resonate very well with individuals. And if you look at, how low, if there's a safe dose that has been established by the World Health Organization, EPA, the Center for Toxicological Research, et cetera, and you compare the values found to those safe levels, you can really put together a strong example of why you don't need to worry. For instance, I'll bring it up, and it's a very touchy topic. Glyphosate obviously is really under the radar by many groups, et cetera. But if you look at some of the data coming out of the different groups and for those of you who don't know, glyphosate is the active compound in Roundup. But I would say, as a toxicologist, glyphosate is one of the safest pesticides we know of. And if you look at a lot of these analytical data that comes out of glyphosate in this product or that product, and I'll use cereal because that's one of these groups had looked at a number of cereals with glyphosate that they found at parts per billion levels. You really get to a risk paradigm when you compare to the safe levels of glyphosate, where in actuality, a toddler would really suffocate in the amount of cereal he or she would have to eat before getting to the safe dose as established by EPA, World Health Organization, the German Risk Assessment Authority for glyphosate. And so if you can relate it to something like that, bring it down to units, how small that represents. And this goes to risk. Just the presence equals a risk in consumers' mind. But if you distill it down to how small they were able to detect these residues, the amount you would have to eat in order to get past the safe level for a 20-pound child, that really resonates with individuals saying it's impossible to eat that much product to surpass a safe level for that given compound. So those are just some snippets I've used in the past that are very effective. And sometimes I think the hardest thing as scientists is to convey a peer-reviewed journal article in 2 sentences to the lay individual. If you can master that, you will be very successful in your career in explaining and interpreting risk.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid response, Brent, and goes back to what you were talking about, perception from the consumer's eye. So very, very solid. There's another question that came in. This one is opinion based. So what's your opinion about Proposition 65 in California? It's a very interesting topic about risk assessment, management, and communication.
I think that Proposition 65, being very transparent with you, is a right to know law. And it has more to do with the right to know of what ingredients or what may be associated with a given product than it has to do with risk. If you look at a lot of the maximum residue limits or no significant risk levels as defined by OEHA, which is the Office of Environmental Health Hazard and Assessment in California, a lot of those levels have taken a very precautionary approach rather than risk assessment approach, especially if you compare those levels to established limits by authoritative bodies. And so I think we need to, obviously it's a regulatory concern for everybody on the call. And we need to comply with the regulations as stipulated by the state of California. But as it relates to true risk assessment, they take a very precautionary based approach to their assessment that in some cases really isn't feasible. And in some cases, the endogenous or natural levels of certain compounds are higher and found in the environment, in the Earth's crust, than what is stipulated in their law. And so if you keep in mind that it's a right to know law rather than a true risk law, and people may disagree with me on that, but if you keep that in mind, it'll put it in perspective for you in terms of what kind of risk are you trying to manage. In my career, and in my opinion, I think the largest risk you're trying to manage as it relates to Prop 65 are regulatory compliance issues in the state and legal concerns from lawsuits, et cetera, rather than focusing on the safety and those levels associated with that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, I am. My interest is very intrigued. I'm gonna go have to do some more research on this Proposition 65. We have. I know we're a little bit past the 30-minute mark, but one more question. So talking about just the display of information, ingredients, and chemicals that are in some common products. Just out of curiosity, do you have any thoughts on any manufacturers or, in your personal experience, that are doing it well, that you feel like provide a really good overview? Or maybe, as you were kind of speaking earlier, not going into quite as much detail. You were questioning kind of the need for that. But do you have any thoughts on, any manufacturers who are displaying that information well?
The information as it relates to what, Kirsten, again? I'm sorry, I missed that part.
No, you're good. Chemical composition and in terms of labeling and such.
Well, I mean, we're bound by labeling laws, whether you're selling in Europe, Canada, US. So I would encourage you, obviously, that we are bound by those labeling, what's required to be on the label, what's required to be in the nutrition deck, et cetera. In terms of who's doing that well, I think there's numerous companies that are doing that well, and they're based on what's required by law. I think this is a good segue into next month's topic, which I'll be talking on, is really, it's going to be around food allergen labeling. And some of you may go, well, I know all about that. I want to take it a little bit further and talk to you about the psychology of a food allergic consumer's mind and how they look at labels, and specifically how they look at the precautionary allergen labeling statement, which is not part of FALCPA. It's not a regulated statement, but we see it on numerous products: may contain, produced in a facility that contains, produced on the same line that contains, and how the food allergic community views those labels. So I'll kind of add a little bit to the last question, going back to that question. I mentioned in my talk that I think the real danger of chemophobia is that we dilute messages of true chemical safety risks in some regard. And I think there are true chemical safety risks when you look at the entirety of the supply chain of food that we need to focus on, so that levels are attenuated, so they don't reach finished product consumers, and they're safe. Obviously, food allergens is the biggest impact here. But I think there are a number of natural compounds that form, especially in the grain-based industries, called mycotoxins. And those need to be managed very well. One of the most potent liver carcinogens we know of is aflatoxin. And so it's natural, it's organic, and it can occur on numerous crops in any given year, based on weather patterns, based on insect damage, et cetera, et cetera. And so while there are chemicals we need to address, I think there are a lot of chemicals that just aren't talked about and are demonized inappropriately in our food supply, whether it be packaging or in the foods themselves, that we need to really wrap our arms around, so that we're not diluting the message of true chemical risks that may be associated with the supply chain, that are all natural, organic, and that we really need to manage up and down the supply chain to ensure the safety of food and ingredients for years to come.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I felt like that was a really good segue too. I won't spoil the conclusion and what we're looking forward to next month. But I will say this does conclude our questions, and I want to thank everyone for sending those in. So Aaron, I will kick it on back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I appreciate this. And everyone on the line, you're going to be hearing a lot more from Kirsten. So thanks so much. She's joined the Safety Chain team and is going to do wonderful, wonderful things with FSMA Friday and even our sister webinar series, Beyond Compliance. So a couple of things real quick, lots of good resources. If you are new to this, please go over to the Atchison Group. Their newsletter is a must read, so go sign up for it. They also have a bunch of other good stuff there. Excuse me. You can get all of the recordings for FSMA Friday of Safety Chain and a lot of content there as well. Go out to your LinkedIns, stay connected there on LinkedIn. There's a FSMA Friday LinkedIn group. Go ask to join it. We want to see you there. Lots of Q&A articles and updates. So join FSMA Fridays. Then I wanted to turn it over very quickly. We've got some more webinars coming up. You can see all of these, but Brent, tell us a little bit about the next FSMA Friday. This is going to be interesting. I really love this approach that you're taking with some of these topics.
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit about it with some of the questions related to this particular webinar, but I really want to dive and really have a short overview of kind of the psychology of living with food allergens and what we as an industry can do to make sure that we're driving truth in our labeling. And I think I'm going to, not think, but I'm going to be focusing on the precautionary allergen labeling statement. And we do know that members of the food allergic community take risks depending on the verbiage in the precautionary allergen labeling statement, because some individuals simply don't trust the statement. So how do we get better as an industry, making sure those are truthful and really conveying risks to the food allergic community so that they can begin to trust the products more and more? But I'll be diving a little bit deeper into some peer-reviewed literature in terms of the psychology of living with food allergens and what some of these individuals within this particular community are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, so that it can help drive your decisions as an organization about how you convey risk to this particular community on your front of pack label or within your ingredient deck.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to that, and I know I can speak for Kirsten as well. She is too. So I really appreciate the deeper side of the science, really going into the psychology of this. Fantastic presentation, Brent. Thank you so much for being here. That'll wrap it up for us, though. Brent, any other recommendations we'll get to next FSMA Friday? Sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just mention too that if there are any lingering questions and questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer those. And disagreements are always welcome too. That's the only way we're going to get better as scientists, as risk assessors, and so we learn from one another. So please don't hesitate to reach out should you have any questions or comments.
Brilliant. All right. Well said, Brent. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for spending some time with us. We'll see you next FSMA Friday. That'll wrap it up for us today. Everyone have a great weekend. Cheers.